Ya mismo. All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm truly delighted to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Eduardo Mendieta, who is professor of philosophy at SUNY Stony Brook and has done just very influential work on Latinos in the U.S., globalization and post-colonial theory, and critical theory. He received his PhD from the New School for Social Research and holds degrees from Rutgers and the Union Theological Seminary, and he also spent time at Goethe University at Frankfurt. He is the author of Adventures of Transcendental Philosophy, Karl Otto Appel, Semiotics and the Discourse Ethics, Global Fragments, terrific book, Globalizations, Latin Americanisms, and Critical Theory from SUNY, 2007, and is presently finishing a book on philosophy and war entitled Philosophy's War, Nomos, Topos, and Polemos. I'll say more about his fascinating new project that he was actually sharing with us last night in a second. Dr. Mendieta is also written many articles on global ethics, discourse ethics, theories of modernity, postcolonialism, and of course Latin American philosophy. But he's also translated and edited numerous important volumes, which include the translation of Enrique Dussel's Ethics of Liberation with Nelson Maldonado Torres, Yolanda Angulo, Camilo Pérez Bustillo, and edited by Alejandro Vallega. He translated Dussel's work also under the title Beyond Philosophy, Ethics, History, Marxism, and Liberation Theology, and has co-edited with Linda Alcoff, Thinking from the Underside of History, Enrique Dussel's Philosophy of Liberation. He's edited many volumes, including Latin American Philosophy, Current Issues and Debates, Latin American Postmodernity, Religions, Globalizations, Teorías sin Disciplinas, and so on and so forth. I won't continue to mention titles because I will take too much of his time. we want to hear about what he has to say today. But he's working on a fascinating project currently on what he calls philosophical animals, in which he claims that, and I quote, the metaphorics of humanity is entwined with the metaphorics of animality. And he aims to complicate this picture by introducing the issues of biotechnology and genomics. Along with customary bestiaries that accompany philosophical investigations about the nature of the human, he claims, we have now to consider the already well-populated transgenetic zoos of biotechnological chimeras of the genomic age. Fascinating.
Did I write that?
Yes, you did. So the title of Dr. Mendieta's talk is From Political Theology to the Politics of Liberation, Justice After, Before the Law. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mendieta.
Okay, Rocio, thank you so much. That introduction makes me sound really irresponsible because I should be doing more focused work. I'm very happy that Enrique actually went before me because he's provided me with an illustration of my paper. So my paper is this. It's going to be about this. The paper works around three basic propositions. The first one is that America is a theological event. The second, which is a paraphrasing of that, America is a religious quest and project. And now with the help of Nelson's talk, I would use a a third formulation, that America was invented through a theological suspension of the ethical that makes both possible and indispensable massacre and genocide. So in order to make these propositions plausible, to convince you of their truth content, I like to begin by talking about the theological problem and the revival of political theology in contemporary thought. Pierre Manet opens his brief but highly original and provocative intellectual history of liberalism with a chapter in which he articulates what he calls the theological political problem. According to him, Europe has had three dominant forms of political organization: empire, city-state, and church. Empire has remained operative to our day, although Manet does not make it clear or does not acknowledge this. Nonetheless, if we think of the Hellenic, Roman, Byzantium, and the Spanish empires, to mention only a few, we can notice immediately that this form of organization is predicated on political subordination and economic exploitation. City-states, which have coexisted with empire, was also a significant form of political organization, effective even until the 19th century, when many Italian city-states or principalities were unified under the Italian nation-state. City-states became the capitals of kingdoms, a form that was similar to empire, but at the least disavowed absolute political subordination and economic exploitation. In any event, both forms, empire and city-states, represented what Manet calls natural forms of political organization. They arose from the natural self-affirmation of humans and addressed itself to natural needs, powers, and competencies of humans. The third form of organization was the church, which, due to different contingent factors, had to take over the functions of empire. According to Manet, however, due to circumstantial and structural reasons, the church as a principle of organization was from the very beginning sundered by internal contradiction. On the one hand, due to circumstantial factors, the church had to take over the administrative and logistical task of the collapsing Roman Empire, which was partly brought down by the so-called barbarian invasions and the plagues that depopulated the cities of the Roman Empire. These tasks were anathema to the church that had declared itself only a community of those who would be saved. On the other hand, due to structural reasons, theological reasons, the church had to attend to the goodness of every soul, their proper tending and pasturing, so that they could be saved. These two roles were at odds and in profound tension with each other. Therein arose what Manet calls the theological political problem, a problem that is expressed in terms of a paradox. And here's the way that Manet puts the paradox. I quote, "Although the church leaves men free to organize themselves within the temporal sphere as they see fit, it simultaneously tends to impose a theocracy on them. It brings a religious constraint of a previously unheard scope, and at the same time offers the emancipation of secular life. Unlike Judaism and Islam, the church does not provide a law that is supposed to govern concretely all of men's actions in the earthly city." Now, in this formulation, Manet is clearly making reference to St. Augustine's Civitate Dei, but he neither exploits nor links Augustine's first Christian treatise of political theology to what he calls the theological political problem. In fact, Augustine's Christian political philosophy is the philosophical theological articulation of what he himself calls, Manet, the theological political problem. We are citizens of two cities, the origins of which and love thereunto are diametrically opposed. The dominance of one means the rejection of the other. Augustine unwittingly makes evident in this great treatise what we can call a Christian anti-political politics, namely a view of politics that rejects the political, that undermines the pursuits of politics, and that ultimately delegitimates the political. We can see then how the Occident has been caught in the grip of a paradox. It must save every soul by affirming its universality, which I like to call the salvational burden, while at the same time it must leave each individual to pursue their specific form of life. Using Foucault's language, we could say that pastoral power remains operative at all levels of social organization, at the same time that it proclaims that the most optimal form of governmentality is one that abandons individuals to their own means. Returning to Manet's formulation, we can also say that that the Occident has been caught in this double bind of secularization by means of modernization of religion. And the more profane life is secularized, the more other ways of being religious are generated. For this reason, secularization does not mean the abolishing of religion due to its ceaseless renewal. Indeed, secularization is itself the means for the living out or witnessing to one's faith. Secularization, in other words, is not the other of religion, but instead is religion's own means of retaining a hold on sociality. That's what I think Manet's paradox is about. Over the last decade, major thinkers have taken what at first blush may appear as an unusual topic for heated discussion, namely the topic of political theology. It could be claimed that it is unusual insofar as so much of the self-proclaimed identity of the Occident is based on the coupling of modernity to secularization. The Occident claims for itself a vanguard position in the vector of historical teleology precisely because it thinks its thinkers, its philosophers, associate its modernity to both rationalization and secularization. To be modern is to be secular. To be secular is to submit all forms of social organization to the logic of rationalization that is the opposite of religion. Modernity is the distinct age in which reason is the only arbiter, and everything, whether it is a practice, belief, or institution, must be submitted to the inspection of reason. Political theology, then, would seem to hearken us back to a time before modernity, to a time when practices, belief, and institutions require a religious and theological justification. In its most attenuated form, however, political theology argues that both the substance and grammar of contemporary political institutions are a sublimation and borrowing from theology itself. To this extent, then, political theology also argues that the age of modernity is still tethered to another time, another age, and thus cannot affirm its sovereignty without self-delusion. The revival of political theology might have to do with circumstantial factors, such as massive global migrations, the so-called global war on terror, a terror that has religious sources and rationalizations, the crisis of national identities due to the emergence of a global public sphere, and, of course, the recent economic crisis that have catalyzed into political legitimation crises that call for other sources of loyalty and solidarity. Yet, arguing along with Manet, we can claim that the return of political theology is neither simply contingently circumstantial nor a passing intellectual fashion. Inasmuch as the Occident has been caught in the grip of what Manet calls the political theological problem, thinkers in the West, in the Occident, cannot but have to ask about the relation between its secular institutions and the religious sources. Political theology does not simply aim to delegitimate the modern age or the age of modernity. It aims to think through the dialectic that is at the basis of Western culture itself, namely the dialectic between the religious and the secular. The problem is that political theology, at least in the versions that stand under Carl Schmitt's shadow, arrests the dialectic by bringing to a standstill the process by means of which the secular is generated out of religious sources for the sake of the preservation of religion itself. Now, the work of Enrique Dussel and Franz Hinckelhammer are perhaps the most important contributions to come out of Latin America that confronts the revival of political theology, not simply dismissing it as an atavistic revival, but by attacking it at its very core. That is to say, the fundamental assumption that the political feeds off of the religious. In the following, I want to focus on a unique text by Dussel that illustrates how his politics of liberation responds to the revival of political theology without either merely dismissing it or naively endorsing it. This next section is called On Prismatic Hermeneutics, How to Read Sacred Texts in Order to Save Them. So I will begin by focusing on a recent text by Dussel, namely the liberatory event of Paul of Tarsus, which is translated in 2009. Now, this text is part of a larger project, the third volume of the Politics of Liberation, of which two have already appeared. Volume one presents what is surely the first critical world history of political philosophy. It is critical because it places itself beyond the constitutive myths that have guided the production of histories of political philosophy and the very thinking of politics and the political in the West. In the prologue to Volume 1 of the Politics of Liberation, Dussel enumerates 7 conceptual limitations that have hobbled and blinded contemporary political philosophy. And these are very important. First, he challenges the Hellenocentrism that informs so much of modern philosophy. Second, Occidentalism. Third, Eurocentrism. Fourth, a self-serving periodization of world history that skews the perception of history in favor of the formation of Europe. Fifth, and this is my point of departure, a critique at the obfuscating secularism that distorts the role of religion in the emergence of modern societies, not simply of the West, but also of non-Western societies. Sixth, the occlusion and negation of the theoretical, philosophical, and conceptual contributions that non-Western societies have made to the evolution of both political institutions and their theoretical conceptualization and understanding. And seventh, finally, the devaluing and suppression of the pivotal role that the discovery, invention of the New World has had in the emergence of the modern world, and in tandem, the devaluation of the contributions produced in the Americas to modern political thought. The entire volume, as well as the entire trilogy, is not simply a critique. It is also a positive contribution to the writing of a different kind of the history of political philosophy that departs from a different locus than that which is enabled by those 7 blinders, limitations, and ideological distortions. In his critical world history, we can encounter the well-known figures in the history of Western political thinking: Hobbes, Locke, Machiavelli, Schmidt, Rawls, Habermas, but also a whole series of figures that have been as important, even if they have been neglected at best and entirely ignored at worst. People like Ginés de Sepúlveda, Bartolomé de las Casas, Francisco de Vitoria, Felipe Guama Poma de Ayala, and so on. This history culminates with the presentation of a history of political thought in Latin America in 5 periods, and you got a sense of that yesterday. From the western states of the Indians through the colony, the early modern period, to the period of first emancipation, the development of the new institutions and the emergence of modern state, to the failure of the post-colonial state before the challenges of neo-imperialism. This history, thus, is a work that is suffused by a prodigious generosity that is only matched by its critical reflexivity that prevents it from retreating to the safe theoretical bunkers of received ideological chronologies and self-serving histories. For the moment, I want to foreground Dussel's critique of secularism as an ideological formation that has distorted the evolution of political thought in and outside the West. Even as sui generis as Dussel is among, and Hinckelhammer is among Latin American philosophers, he's part of a cohort of thinkers who have contributed to one of Latin America's most creative and generative religious and intellectual traditions, namely liberation theology. Dussel has contributed to the development of this tradition as a historian, as a philosopher, as a Marxologist of the first order, and of course, as a historian of the church. At the center of this movement, liberation theology, for it was a movement, and it remains a social movement both within and outside the Catholic Church, is the imperative to develop a religious critique of political systems of oppression. Liberation theology is a political theology from its very inception. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to foreground. It emerged to develop a religious critique of political systems of oppression while also developing a political critique of religion. Liberation theology means both the liberation of religious thinking and the religious thinking of liberation. The religious critique of the world, about which the young Karl Marx wrote, was turned by liberation theologians into the theological, political, and economic critique of neo-colonial and neo-imperialistic servant states that pushed their military boots on the face of Latin American people. It would be a major mistake to think of Dussel's wolf as an appendage or extension to the liberation theology's corpus. But it would also be a mistake not to see how that tradition and work has shaped some of Dussel's own orientation and problems. One of those is precisely the problem of how to approach the biblical texts that are the source of Christian faith. Secularism, as an ideology, is a way to cordon off, to isolate, to immunize Christian foundational texts from new, generative, transforming appropriations, and above all, to render them ahistorical or transhistorical. Secularism dehistorizes the religion appropriation of sacred texts, and in this way, it also dehistorizes faith. By dehistorizing faith, the Christian doctrine, it closes off the future. Secularism severs the umbilical cord that links a religious outlook, practice, and form of life from its sacred text. At the same time, secularism dissimulates and camouflages the ways in which these texts remain determined for the West and for the Occidental way of life. For this reason, to overcome secularism, to demystify its mythologies, means to approach the religious aspects of any culture in terms of its religious vitality, in terms of the ways in which sacred texts remain operative, generative, nourishing of that culture, while also recognizing the historicity of these very sacred texts. It may be said, then, that to overcome secularism is to be on the side of secularization, if by this later term we understand a social historical process that both secures and translates the religious meaning of a sacred corpus. It is secularization that allows the very preservation, protection, and empowerment of sacred traditions, not against these very traditions, but for their own sake. If secularism may be conceived as anathema to religion, If secularism may be considered as anathema of religion, secularization may be thought of as religion's offspring and protector. For it is secularization that shelters while also empowering the sources of a religious outlook. This is made more evident when we recognize that secularization is unleashed by the very relationship of a faith or confession, that the kind of relationship a faith or confession has to its own text and religious practices. Secularization is but the name of the process by which a religious tradition relates to its sources, its sacred text. And I think this is one of the great contributions of liberation theologians. Segundo, as well as Dussel, as Hinckelammer, have worked on this kind of relationship of religious tradition to its sacred text. Now, a sacred text becomes one, or rather is so canonized, because it is thought to contribute to the elucidation of a faith's core vision. A religious experience is always a hermeneutical circle. There are no religious events, brute facts or revelations, or sacred happenings. All that there is always the exegesis and interpretation in light of what a community takes to be its faith, its beliefs, its proclamation, its confession. A sacred text, in other words, is never found as a sacred text. Rather, it is so interpreted. A sacred text is always already an interpreted text. Every sacred text is the remnant of a series of interpretive practices. As a product of interpretive practices, sacred texts are always being read in different ways, from different angles, with different aims and finalities in mind. A sacred text is thus always already a sacred text, that is to say, one that begs to be read differently precisely because it is the product of a plurality of interpretive enactments. To put it in another formulation, a sacred text is one that is always desacralizing itself so that it can remain sacred. A sacred text is thus a prismatic text, a refracted and refracting text. Sacred texts, thus, are the history of their production as sacred texts and history of the reception as sacred. If, as the famous saying goes, that the West is, in the West, philosophy is a long footnote or a long series of footnotes to Plato, then we could say that Christianity is one long history of the appropriation of sacred texts into sacred texts. And here I play off on the sacred in quotes and then sacred without quotes. Sacred in the sense that they're not sacred yet because we haven't decided that they're sacred. You know, the Bible is an invented text. And so there's this process of appropriating text into sacred without the quotation marks. So evidently, this applies mutati mutandis to other faiths, even if they're not grounded on a book or group of books. Even oral traditions are caught in this hermeneutical circle for the production of the religious text through acts of interpretation. I take it that it is from the standpoint of the critique of secularism, for the sake of secularization, that Dussel is engaging Paul of Tarsus. Indeed, the history of Christianity is the history of different ways in which Paul the Apostle has been read, not just by Christians, but by many others as well. Secular Christians, Jews, non-Christians, non-Jews, and so on and so forth. In the following, I want to show how that Dussel reads Paul in a dialectical way, in what I call here a prismatic hermeneutic way. That is to say, first, by attending to the Sitzim Leben, that is to say, the context in life that has a historical interpreted context in which Paul produced his own text, and how that existential and historical situation continues to disrupt the Pauline text. Second, by attending to the ways in which this Sitzim Leben, this situation in life, has been excluded, concealed, and negated when appropriating Paul's text. Third, by reading Paul against our own contemporary problems and questions. It is by reading Paul against and through his Sitzim Leben, I argue, that Dussel is able to show how there are in Paul's letters a series of critical categories, to use the expression he uses in this text. In fact, one of the things that Dussel does is to read Paul not simply as a Christian foundational writer, but as the beginning of a kind of critical political theology. So, in a third and final part of the paper, if I get there, I will turn to Dussel's reading of Agamben as it is articulated in the text that I'm commenting, in order to show that while Agamben is closer to Dussel than Dussel himself is willing to admit, Agamben falls short of what Dussel offers through his prismatic hermeneutics. So let me just then go on. The paradox of Paul, the critical consensus of a people divided against itself. That's this. Paul is a paradox, one that may reveal the truth of Christianity. Nietzsche's juxtaposition of Paul against Jesus articulates this paradox, but in the negative way. Nietzsche's Animus diatribe, vile against Paul's in his famous The Antichrist, summarizes but also potentiates a vituperative interpretation that thinks of Paul as the Jew that betrayed Jesus, the Jew that gave us the Catholic Church. Nietzsche's Paul is the expression of an exasperation with this paradox, the paradox of Paul. Paul's own letters, as well as the Acts of Apostle, offer us ample material to sketch this paradox. For instance, in Philippians 3, we have Paul's own candid autobiography, and I quote, circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law a Pharisee, as to zeal a persecuted of the church, as to righteousness under the law blameless. The zeal to be a persecutor of the church is repeated in other places in Paul's letters, but also in Acts 8, where it is written, but Saul was ravaging the church and entering house after house. He dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. In Galatians 1:13, we have Paul's description of his zealotry in the following terms, and I quote, for you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the tradition of my fathers. Close quote. we could synoptically write that Saul of Tarsus came from the Jewish tribe of Benjamin, had been circumcised on the 8th day in accordance with Jewish tradition, and after a strict Orthodox Jewish upbringing, had joined the sect of the Pharisees. This means that Paul had been trained in the interpretation of the Jewish law and the Hebrew sacred text. He thus knew Hebrew well and very likely Aramaic. Additionally, born in Tarsus, capital of the Roman province of Cilicia, meant that Paul was a Roman citizen by birth, even he later confessed to having bought a Roman citizenship. Here at Acts 22, 28, and 29. As Hans Kuhn has put it, profiling the young Paul, and I quote, "So we must imagine the young Paul as a reflective, deeply serious Pharisee of strict observance, influenced by contemporary Jewish apocalyptic, zealous for the law and the preservation of the tradition of the fathers. He was born probably at almost the same time as Jesus, but grew up in a Hellenistic environment in which Greek was the everyday language and therefore his mother tongue." Close quote. Paul, very importantly, was not one of Jesus' direct apostles. He did not know Jesus in the flesh, nor was he directly related to any of the apostles who were charged by Jesus to bring the gospel to the world. As Paul confesses in Galatians 1:11, and I quote, "For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through a revelation of Jesus Christ." Close quote. And then he adds later, after confessing his will to destroy the church of God, and I quote, but when he who has sent me set me apart before I was born and had called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son for me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I did not confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go to the Jerusalem of those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia, and again I returned to Damascus. Close quote. In Acts 9, we have the narrative of Paul's conversion, but also the confirmation that he was feared in the Christian communities because he was infamous for his zealous pursuit of the apostles and Christians. In fact, Ananias' response to God's call to come to Saul thus, and I quote, "Lord, I have heard from many about these men, how much evil has been done to thy saints as Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who can call upon my name." To summarize, the paradox of Paul then is that of a devout doctrinaire Jew, a Pharisee who became an apostle to the Gentiles through revelation and conversion. Kuhn expresses this paradox in the following way. Did he ever give up his Jewish faith? That is the question for Jews. And did he really understand Jesus of Nazareth rightly? Or did he make something else of him? This is the question for Christians. And I think that Kuhn captures very well what is problematic with Paul, this paradox of Paul. Whether Paul was either too much or too little Jewish or Christian is of relevance to Jews and Christians alike. But it is also to all those who are addressed as Gentiles. It is from this paradox, this too much or this too little, that Christian universalism is elucidated. But just as importantly, it is from the standpoint of a devoutly, even zealous observant of the law, a Pharisee, that we get the paradox of one who abolishes the law through its observance. The law as such is not negated by Paul, but is revealed to be burdened with what Franz Hinkelhammer calls a curse. And here I'm referring to la maldición que pesa sobre la ley, the curse that weighs upon the law. While Jesus critiques the law through his actions, healing on the Sabbath, failing to condemn in accordance with the law, it is Paul who announces that the law is subordinated to the life of the community. The law is for life, not life for the law. Hinkelhammer has eloquently articulated the paradox of Christianity's critique of the law as it is articulated in Jesus and Paul's preaching. And I quote Hinkelhammer here. Law is necessary for living. It consists in ceasing to treat the law as given for life. In legalistic terms, law destroys the human being when it eliminates human life as its source of discernment and reflexivity of law. This legalistic law is criticized by Jesus, which is followed in every faithful terms by Paul's critique of the law. According to Paul, a curse waits over the law, which appears only when salvation is sought through the observance of the law. This curse makes the law kill. Law is violent, and behind the law threatens sin. It destroys the human being and turns him into the great lie according to which the law saves us, law of legalistic fulfillment. For this reason, when fulfilling the law, an injustice is performed. An injustice is not itself the transgression of law. Injustice is, instead, committed through fulfilling the law. Close quote. Hinckelammer, Dussel, and Agamben coincide in focusing on this revolutionary, liberating, critical dimension of Paul's work, namely in seeing him as a critique of legalism or a critique of a legality that becomes necrophilic, but not so as to denounce the law, but rather to affirm the power of the law, so long as this never ceases to be guided by what Hinckelammer calls the source of his discernment and reflexivity, namely the life of the community. Agamben refers to this aspect of Paul when he writes the following. The caesura between constitutive and constituted power, a divide that has become so apparent in our times, find its theological origins in Pauline's split between the level of faith and that of nomos, between personal loyalty and the positive obligation that derives from it. In this light, Messianism appears as a struggle within the law, whereby the element of the pact and constituent power leans toward setting itself against and emancipating itself from the entole, the norm in the strict sense. The Messianic is therefore the historical process whereby the archaic law between law and religion reaches a crisis, and the element of pistis, of faith in the pact, tends paradoxically to emancipate itself from any obligatory conduct and from positive law. Close quote. The cut of, or disruption between a constituted and constituting power, the abyss between an established order and a new order, is the pivotal issue of fetishized law. That's why Enrique was making constitutive, the critique of the community, I'll explain further that here. A law that has become for life unchanging and unchanging, which commands that it be fulfilled even if the world should perish. Fiat justitia et pereat mundus. In Hinckelammer's term, law for life, set in stone as a totem, is law against life. Law for life, at the service of life, is law that is guided by the life of a community. What is at stake is more than the mere conflict between legitimacy and legality, the norm and the law, authority and power, but rather precisely that there is a surplus, a remnant that is not encompassed by the co-determination of one by the other, norm and law. Dussel gets at this problem more directly and clearly than Agamben when he focuses his analysis of Paul through a reading of Romans in terms of 6 fundamental theses. First, the meaning of justification as a criterion of legitimation. Justification as a criteria of legitimation. Second, the legitimation of a certain order with reference to the law. Third, the collapse of legitimation due to the fetishization of the law. Fourth, the development of a new justificatory criterion. 5, the constitution of a messianic community that erupts into the established order, disrupting it. 6, the creation of a new order beyond the fetishized law. There's a long list of movements that take place in Paul's text, but the running thread here is that the ambiguity of the law, that is the inoperability and indiscernibility of law, or what Agamben calls the unobservability and unformulability of the law. For Dussel, however, What is important in Paul is not simply the critique of fetishized law, but rather the project of developing a new justificatory criterion. How do we discover that the law has become fetishized if every practice in a given order is guided by the norm that finds itself embodied in the law? How can we see what is destroyed and killed if it is allowed to be seen only by the law? We must be situated outside or beyond the law to see the nefarious consequences of a law blindly observed and performed. How is constituted power to be evaluated and judged if all that is legitimate is precisely what this constituted power permits to be said and seen? How is the law to be judged? This is what makes Paul so important to Christianity. For he lived by the law and from the law. And here there's a passage from Romans which I think is very key to Enrique's argument. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet, if it had not been for the law, I should not have known sin. I should have not known sin, what it is to be coveted, if the law had not said, thou shalt not covet. But sin finds opportunity in the commandment, wrought in me all kinds of covetousness. Apart from the law, sin lies dead. Apart from the law, sin lies dead. I once alive apart from law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. The very commandment which promised life proved to be death to me. This is a complicated passage which actually Hinckelammer explains in the following way. He says that what we find in Paul is a distinction between los pecados y el pecado. That is to say, sin with capital S, the sin, el pecado, and sin with little s, los pecados. And that los pecados, sins, are committed by violating the law. But sin, capital S, is performed when we seek to enforce the law as justice. So this is what Hinckelammer thinks is operating here in Romans, and this is a reading that Enrique endorses as well. What Paul may have meant when he wrote that by the law he knew sin, that by the very commandment that promised life, death came to him, may be deciphered in Acts, where we read that Saul approves the execution of Christians. The law as such is not enough to guide us away from sin. The law may guard us, be our custodian, as Paul puts it in Galatians 3, but how it is by faith that God's righteousness is manifested. And here, for we hold that a man is justified by faith apart from the work of law. Or as it is written in Galatians 3 to 27, I'll just keep that citation and go directly. For Dussel, as for Agamben, the operative phrase is here justified by faith. If law was our custodian, now we are free by faith. We experience God's justice through faith. We're justified in God's justice through faith. But what is this faith? What is faith for Paul? And why specifically justified by faith? Such a key critical concept for a politics of liberation, as Dussel and Hinckelammer tried to develop it. Faith, or pistis in Greek, and emunah in Hebrew, refers to the credit one gives to another, the confidence one places on another, and the trust that is placed upon someone or something. Faith, like trust, is relational. It has a passive and an active dimension, as well as a quasi-reciprocal aspect. To have faith is a volitional act. I have faith. I place my confidence and trust upon someone. At the same time, I am at the mercy, at the disposition of he or she on whom I have placed my faith. I am vulnerable before him on whom I have placed my faith. There is thus there is a potentiality to faith. It is a generation of power, a potentia, to use Enrique Dussel's term. And here I am referring to a paragraph in this text. But faith expresses and generates a relational power. In faith, what grants a power, and by granting that power, one submits to it. There is power in faith. For this reason, we say, by the power of faith, or the power that faith grants to me, and many similar expressions. It is a power that emanates from this relational, even if it is not a symmetrical relation. Faith is a weakening strength. Faith is a weakening strength at this empowering power. It is an empowering vulnerability. And here I want to quote from Emile Benevist, who can make us help clarify what this faith means as a power. The one who holds the fides placed on him by a man has this man at his mercy. Here's the word mercy again. So by having faith on someone, one is at their mercy. This is why fides becomes almost synonymous with disio and potestas. In their primitive form, these relations involve a certain reciprocity, placing one's fides in somebody's secure return his guarantee and his support. But this very fact underlies the inequality of the conditions. It is authority which is exercised at the same time as a protection for someone who submits to it, an exchange for and to that extent of his submission. Here, Benveniste links faith to fides, that is to say, to rule, dominion, authority, and thus to potestas, to power and sovereign rule. What Benveniste points out additionally is that while the relationship is prima facie one of a certain reciprocity, there is always a more fundamental inequality and asymmetry. The power we grant to the one on whom we place our faith can be betrayed. Yet, rather than foreground this asymmetry, I think that we must underscore the proportionality of the power that is granted to whom one submits. Faith implies also the extent to which one submits, the power and depth of one's faith. This power, this potestas, this empowering vulnerability is the transformative and liberatory dimension of faith. Faith liberates precisely because of the potestas that it generates, grants and bestows and returns augmented to the one that grants it. This is why Paul's justification by faith may be translated as justified by the power that we entrust on the community of belief, or justified by the empowered vulnerability of the confidence and trust we place on each other. So faith is this power that a community generates for its own sake, for its own transformation. Faith is thus a relational potestas of the community of belief in which the community empowers itself towards something in the future. And here I quote Dussel, who makes this point very clearly. The Messianic community, the people, confronting the immense power of the Roman Empire, the temple of Israel, and tradition, nevertheless dare to confront these powers from the certainty of possessing a conviction that can transform reality in its totality. That certainty, that critical consensus of the community itself is what is called emuna in Hebrew, or pistis in Paul's Greek, and which could be described as the enthusiastic certainty of the critical community, whose source is to be found in the people itself. Faith, then, is the name for that critical consensus of a messianic community that stands against the extant consensus in the name of a new order. Again, here the graph. A critical transformative power that inaugurates a new order of justification. Faith, the reflexive potestas of the critical community, another way to think of the messianic community, is the construction of a new legality. It is for this reason that for Dussel, faith, and for Hinckelammer as well, faith can be translated in the following way, as mutual confidence that is continuous through time as the intersubjective fidelity of the members of such a community conceive of the responsibility to create a new agreement, contract, alliance, or testament. This new agreement would legitimate or justify, judge as just, the fearless praxis of the extreme danger of messianic time as a source for the legitimation of a future system. And here I was quoting a long paragraph from Dussel. What would need to be commented on this Dusselian formulation is here the term, a fearless praxis of the extreme danger of messianic time. Why fearless and why extreme danger? It is fearless because it must face a formidable contender, namely itself, with all the tools of power and authority on its side. The messianic community is still part of the community. It is part of the community that has become critical of the hegemonic order. Faith empowers the critical community to challenge, resist, and transform the established consensus and order. In this project of messianic transformation, there is great danger. How does the critical community, with its critical consensus, have confidence that it is establishing a justifies, judge as just order? I want to return to this question below, for it is how this question is answered by Dussel that shows how he differs profoundly from Agamben. But, I have read way too long, and I'd like to summarize my paper, which has like 10 pages left to go. By saying that what we find in the recent work of Dussel, in particular, volume 3 that he's still working on, is an attempt to develop what I call a critical liberatory political theology. So we can talk about a conservative political theology, which is affirming the identity politics of Europe that claims itself as the true possessor of Christianity, and that demonstrates how at the basis of the sacred text of Christianity we find actually critical categories that allows us to challenge the ideology of secularism and to affirm secularization as a process through which this critical core of the sacred text can remain operative in our contemporary critiques of Eurocentrism, Occidentalism, and secular political theology in the tradition of Carl Schmitt. Apologies for a complicated text. Thank you.
Okay. Charles?
No, but didn't you give the word to Charles? Yeah.
I really appreciate the care in this count of what I think of as a midrashic way of understanding sacred texts. Happily. I say I appreciate very much this account of what I think of as a midrashic understanding of sacred texts and of Pauline theology. Within the context of the religious basis of secularization and the movement of liberation through various aspects of secularization, which is a beautiful idea in many ways, I began to wonder, given the power of religion as it's understood here, particularly, exclusively at this point of Christianity, and in a certain way of Pauline Christianity, how does this position connect with Jews, or with the Islamic tradition, or with Buddhists, or with indigenous peoples' religions and traditions? For example, as we dealt with yesterday, the mestizos. I'm not quite sure. I'm puzzled at this juncture by the enormity or the exclusivity of a very powerful religious theological position in Christianity and in the West when it comes to define what the means of liberation are. And I'm wondering, for example, if indigenous people could possibly recognize this as liberatory.
Mm-hmm.
I'm quite sure I know the responses of a variety of Jews on this. Yeah. I assume that Islamic people, the numbers are growing in this country daily. I'm quite sure Islamic people would recognize this as an attack. So it's liberated to what and for what within the exclusivity of the profound Christian basis for secularity?
Mm-hmm. That's a really excellent question, because it allows me to clarify something. The claim is not that from a critical analysis of Christian sacred text we get one definition of liberation. That's not the claim. The claim is to demonstrate that the West, insofar as it has this Christian identity and Jewish identity, Jewish Christian identity, has been grappling with this text. And that we have, in the age of modernity, created a distorting ideology, secularism, that prevents us from understanding the way in which our own projects of liberation are related to those, the appropriation of those sacred texts. That allows us to then accept, in fact, praise, in fact, celebrate the ways in which other traditions have also related to their own sacred texts and traditions. So the thrust of the paper is to demonstrate how the critique of secularism allows us to appreciate secularization, a process through which sacred texts remain operative, not just in the West, but in all cultures. So this is in one of the byproducts of this is to encourage a kind of plural relations to different sacred traditions. Now, then the question becomes, why do these texts remain sacred? Not simply the Bible, not simply Paul, but other texts, other sacred texts. And what I'm suggesting is what I call here the prismatic hermeneutics, this process of continuous returning to them in different contexts. So that's what I would say to that. I did not mean to imply, and I don't think this is the claim of liberation philosophy, that there's one way in which we can understand the project of liberation, but rather how within the West we have generated certain understandings out of a confrontation, appropriation of certain sacred text.
Yeah, follow up on that. Yes.
I'm sorry. I appreciate that answer. But the entire context, I mean, the voice that grants this permission sounds distinctly Christian. And I'm wondering about taking, for example, the perspective of an indigenous religion that probably doesn't have what we would recognize, by that I mean normal mainstream Westerners, as sacred texts. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking also of the multiplicity of religions that play in the mestiza traditions. And I'm not sure that even within Western Christianity, there is what you could call one dominating tradition. Now, the Midrashic approach to sacred texts is, I understand that, except no other sacred texts were used except that of Paul. Mm-hmm. And that a very traditional and intricate understanding as a definition of liberation theology. I just could not hear. I understand the toleration that you expect, but if I were in one of these other groups, I would sort of like to have a little more leverage than your toleration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I take it that, I take it because this is my stand, that all my work is oriented by hermeneutical humility. And that begins with the assumption that I have my own limitations. And my limitations are precisely that I am a child of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that I am a child of a certain engagement with certain texts. I did go to theological school. That's where I right. And so I begin with this critical stance towards my own tradition so as to create a space in which people can engage in their own critical engagement with their own sacred traditions. So I hope it's, it's not, they shouldn't be read as a kind of hubristic, arrogant affirmation that there's only one way in which we can approach the projects of liberation. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, here I go. This whole narrative makes me very nervous because the law in that context is the law of the Father. And it's the essence of patriarchy. And the justification either coming through a spokesperson for the law of the Father, or the attempt to move out of one kind of law of the Father in the name of another new regime, which may not carry the same sense of oppression for the next people that are going to be constituted. But if in the process, but I believe there is a hidden premise there, and that is that the impulse that brings this new revision of the law that you mentioned, I think it's still founded in the name of the Father, if not the law of the Father. So, with all the heaviness of this particular tradition in Western culture, in the most extraordinary context of oppression, and given that you have an interest in female theologians, feminist theologians, my second side of the question is, how do feminist theologians deconstruct this ultimate reference to the name of the Father in the deity, to the law of the Father as the law that justifies or lays normative expectations for us if there's people are going to be a people of God or whatever. And the other thing, my concern is this: the law always refers here in Paul to the law of the Father. Even Jesus said, Father, this and that and the other. So even if you go to the New Testament, the ultimate figure is Father. There's no attempt here in this discussion to disengage this whole process of liberation from the law of the Father in the name of the Father. And when you constitute this new community, it rests on some sort of what's called the critical consensus. And as my colleague just said, this critical consensus, how can you have a consensus when there's so much multiplicity and difference? There is no consensus in these liberatory communities. People are always contesting within liberatory movements what is the best way to move ahead, what is the best way to conceive of liberation. So that's why this whole narrative makes me so absolutely nervous. And if you could say anything about what feminist theologians are doing about this, I would be really grateful.
Yes. Also a very good question about the profoundly misogynist dimensions of Christianity. The structure of the critical political theology that I think Inkelammer and Dussel and myself are elaborating has one in which the fulfillment of the law, of the hegemonic law, generates death, right? And this is in the formulation of Inkelammer, is sin, capital S, is generated by the attempt to fulfill the law as the way in which we generate justice. The community challenges this because it leads to death. And so it develops a critical consensus, meaning of coming to terms with the way in which the law is fulfilled now, it leads to death. So that disruption of the community, of the community against the hegemonic fulfillment of the law as justice, and the formulation of a new way, that has a structure that is open to any kind of claims of saying this law, if fulfilled this way, generates death. You could say the law as it is conceived now is a law that is it's genocidal of women. It's against the life of women. So structurally, I don't see why questions of gender and sex are not part of it. In fact, they would have to be part of this new developing of a new consensus. A consensus, perhaps the term is misleading in the sense that it might suggest that people all have assented to one opinion, but rather is the formation of a new understanding of the need for a new order of the law, a new justice. And here I've developed the way in which this new order of justice calls for a new people. And in the same way that there's a critical appropriation of a text, this people understands itself in a new modality. And so this people that formulates a new consensus is a people to come. And that includes not simply a new understanding about how it relates to the law, but how it relates to itself.
It can never be a queer people, right?
Well, why not?
I'm trying to queer the new community. Because, I mean, it's just something that occurs to me right now, excuse me, but, that's where you really do the possibility for the multiple perspectives. Because as long as everything is just say, well, it's the death of women or whatever, that's just too general to really apply to people concretely in their lives. But, so anyway, I leave it there for our imagination to play with.
Okay.
Amos?
Well, thank you. Following the two previous questions, I would probably have to say thank you for your sermon. But not in a joking sense, but in a sense that reminds me of another sermon by Saul Kripke. Sorry to come up with a complete different tradition here, an Alec tradition, but in his famous book, Naming Necessity, he's dealing with Paul from a different perspective. Paul is a rigid designator of a name, and which expresses an identity that indicates a series of issues, a series of what you call the citizen im Leben. I'm doing a little generic interpretation here of Saul Kripke. But anyway, the point he makes in that book is the fact that then there's a point in which this guy, Paul, turns into Saul, or Soul, and we don't know exactly, okay, how's that happening? How can we ascribe names? And here, my translation, my connection to our discussion in this conference, well, the same applies to identity, right? We are talking about Latin America, we talk about Native Americans and so on. So, and one of the questions you ask is, okay, well, in this process, there's one question that raises in our minds, which is, okay, so how can we justify, how can we identify this change, justify the change, and on top of that, say that this change is critical. Mm-hmm. Change is not enough, but like you said, in terms of there's one kind of change, one kind of exception, one kind of a perspective that goes back to Paul, that's Carl Schmitt. Mm-hmm. How can we justify one that is liberatory, one that's critical, one that is more inclusive to add the other questions? So my question then finally is, and here I'm pointing to the more abstract part of your paper, which is the normative element, okay? So in Paul, we see this problem. He was not an apostle. He had no authority.
Right.
Based on the other guys. No, he wasn't a disciple. So he couldn't even claim to be an apostle. And he was questioning the law, as you're telling us. So he had no authority, traditionally speaking, to question the law. And then the question that you raised is, how can we justify, let me read what I wrote down here. How do we know, how can we discover if the law, maybe the Bible, of course, the sacred text, but maybe also the Constitution, is just or not?
Right.
So if that's the case, who has the authority? How did Paul get his authority? And who has the authority today to identify my identity or the correctness and justice of a law?
Right.
Thanks.
The authority comes, the authority comes from the faith of the community, the critical community, that empowers Paul to speak of their critique of the hegemonic consensus. So Paul has no authority other than that which is granted by the critical community. So this is also the relationship between potentia and potestas. Paul has the same relationship to the faith, the community of faith. In fact, Enrique Dussel defined it. He says at one point, faith is when a people believes in itself. It's a power. That's why I went to this discussion about faith is an empowering vulnerability. It generates a certain kind of force. And that's the force that then circles through Paul. Now, how do we evaluate whether this new consensus is more just or is just? That has to do with the reference to the practical truth of a new legal order, whether it really is for the life of the community. And then this is where people come in and say, well, this order, in fact, continues to be necrophilic, or it's not addressing the life needs of the community. So the criteria by means of which we determine whether something is more just or has become just is whether it is for the life of the community. So that's the structure of the argument, yeah.
Just a little follow-up. So what about the identity part? So does that require, the same way it happened with Paul and many others, a new identity?
A new what?
Identity. In other words, this community that is granting power,
yes,
can it be the old community? Would it have to be a new community that is more integrative of different, for example, identities, integrative of difference and so on? So Paul would be an interesting example to say, okay, there needs to be a change. It can't be the same community because something needs to identify that something is new. Thanks.
Yes, indeed. That's I have a whole discussion here. Is when we say we the people, we the community, we are speaking in the form of addressing ourselves to a future. We speak not from the constituted past, but from this community to come. And that's what is interesting about these critical categories that are present in Paul. So, yes, it's the constitution of a new identity, one that is more expansive and more respective of these different claims that this present hegemonic order does not allow for the life of certain members of the community. And that could be gay people, because after all, violence against people with different sexual preferences is a negation of life.
Jason?
I've got a lot of questions swimming around in my head, but I'm going to put this question, I think, in the most basic possible terms. What I really like about the paper is taking seriously a hermeneutical practice in relation to sacred texts. And I take it that part of the sacred character of these texts lives from that practice.
Yes.
But there are other ways it lives too. And the texts themselves even give options for what we pursue and how we pursue those options. And I think what I'm struck by is the compatibility of critique with the Pauline lineage that you point out. But I'm also struck by the fact that when I was when I first encountered liberation theology, it's the Sermon on the Mount and James that count, and it's Oscar Romero who counts. And I worry about what happens to that here. And I worry about the way the hermeneutical practice in relation to Paul becomes a perpetuation of a hermeneutical endeavor that doesn't take one out of that initial hermeneutical space and lead to a conversion of one's life in those categories.
That's a very well said. Yes. I agree with you. I don't have any objections. I take that as a friendly amendment. Thank you.
So we have time for 2 more questions. So we'll go to Omar, and then we will go to Enrique.
Eduardo, thank you for your paper. I'm working on similar things. But my question is more of a provocation. I think that there are 2 things. The first one is, I think it might be interesting to, after you've developed this idea, to go back and actually look at the history of the way in which this messianism has been operative since the conquest onward. Because what you will see is indigenous forms of resistance to this messianism, which are also informed by that very messianism. Mm-hmm. And then you might be able to find ways of displacing, or at least encountering tensions that might open up spaces that I think that my colleagues here are pointing to. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is that this has a real history, that might shed light on, and that is just a provocation. This is not a question. And the other thing is that I also think about the emphasis that you put on texts, and I'm thinking about oral traditions. And the issue of the notion of a sacred text has a kind of is embedded, in a series of assumptions. And I'm thinking about indigenous traditions that are oral traditions that have a different notion of sacredness, right? That encounter it not at the level of text, but when you're walking in the Andes, you run into a stone that looks just like any other stone, and it turns out that it's sacred, right? Or that at least has a kind of significance there. And so these are provocations. There are things that were coming to mind when you were talking about that there might be a genealogical aspect to what you're talking about, and a history aspect, and also a kind of meditation on the worth of the text. That's all.
Yeah, those are very good reflections. I hope you understand just that what I said was honest. I think that your point is very well taken, and of course I'm very concerned that the tradition of liberation theology that looks to the Sermon on the Mountain doesn't get occluded by this. But right now it's a philosophical strategy of confronting a certain kind of the articulation of political theology that I think is highly problematic, imperialistic, and is profoundly obnoxious. And I wanted to demonstrate that there are different ways in which we could utilize certain kind of resources that open up these texts that have become very fetishized in a new way. And that was not to displace the incredible, the Gospel of Sola et Anima, for instance, which I think is an incredible work of interpretation. In this case, we would have to do a history of messianism and a kind of messianism that discounts the critical power of the messianism that liberation theologians are seeing in certain texts. So yes, that's a really interesting suggestion, and the ways in which, for instance, the work of someone like Walter Benjamin can help us make sense of weak messianism, for instance. With respect to the non-text-based sacredness, yes, there are things that are not simply texts which are sacred. There are spaces, there are objects, there are practices, there are whole regions that are sacred, but I think that those sacredness are also constituted to this relation. They are sacred by virtue of how a community of faith relates to them and reconstitute them. That rock that you came across would not be sacred if someone hadn't said to you, by the way, my grandparents, my grandfathers, my ancestors related to this particular object in this way, and now you have to heed that. And so you're being not indoctrinated, but placed within a practice. You're being socialized into a practice of acknowledging something as sacred. For people like me, there is text, and we might talk about the difference between a sacredness that is literal and a sacredness that is oral. And of course, they have different tonalities and have different consequences. I think Vanderbilt gets it really beautifully when, in his early work, when the sacredness of the Judeo-Christian tradition is one that is disembedded. Text, we can go anywhere with the text. I have, Nelson has access to the sacred text right there through his iPod, whereas there's another form of sacredness that is so grounded that you can't just walk away with it. And that's a very, Vanderbilt's reflection is very interesting, but I don't know how to include that in a paper that is really already too long.
Okay, so we have time for one more question about short, sort of.
No, I would like to do an intervention, observation, and perhaps in the end, a question. I will speak strictly as philosopher, only as philosopher. But it's interesting that we react to some problematic that is beginning in Europe. Carl Schmitt wrote a book in 1992, The Political Theology, and this is an absolute other tradition of the Latin America. And he said all the concepts of the political philosophy has a theological origin. And we said evident, but we didn't touch this question before. And after Badiou began to speak an example of the event of the own philosophy of Badiou, of Paul, and Zizek speak on Paul, and Taubes speak on Paul, and Agamben, and many of them. And we say, in Kelamerai and others, we can speak on this question too, but we didn't originate this type of discussion because in my case, I studied strictly political philosophy, and I didn't mezclava. I didn't confuse one theological discourse with a philosophical discourse. And many times the people confuse the both and are very different. So as philosopher, we begin to criticize the interpretation of Paul of the Europeans. And we say, if you speak on the question, we know too the question, and we have a different interpretation. And it's not as theologian, but strictly as political philosopher. And my text on Paul is not the text of a believer, it's a text of a philosopher that took a text. And you say secret text. I prefer to say a text. Can be a religious text, like the Quran, one Upanishad, and all these texts can be interpreted in one philosophical hermeneutic. and it's the strictly philosophical interpretation in the sense of Paul Ricoeur, for example, that I studied the myth of Prometheus and the myth of Adam as philosophers. So as philosopher, I took this text, and it's not as theologian. And I can take, too, the theology of liberation of Latin America as philosophers, and to say that is a fact of our thought, and I can do a philosophical interpretation. I would like to do this first clarification. The second, for example, Juan José Bautista, a colleague of me, began to work all these questions in the Aymara tradition. And we can work these problems in the Aymara tradition, in the Islamic tradition, Buddhist, Hindu, and Confucian traditions. That is universal. We can begin to put questions in all type of cultures. And that were one clarification. And I agree absolutely with Ofelia when she says it's a law of the father. Yes. And it's necessary to do the hermeneutic because this law is a law that's kills, because in other aspects it's too the law of the father. And it's very interesting, this type of interpretation that must be developed too, no?
Yeah. Thank you, Enrique, for those clarifications. Of course, my engagement with that particular text on Paul was to look at it as a philosophical engagement and to demonstrate the plausibility of its analysis. But I hope that you haven't lost sight of how I began, which is with the claim that we have to understand that if we're going to work on an ethics of the Americas, for the Americas in the 21st century, we have to come to terms with, using the language of Nelson Maldonado Torres, that America was invented through a theological suspension of the ethical. And we have to confront the ways in which, in the same way that today the Europeans are affirming their Christianity, we have to understand America as a theological event. And that's why we have to mobilize the resources within Latin American liberation philosophy and all kinds of critical currents, Latin American feminists, theologians, to confront this fact, this massive, very profound fact. And so the aim of the paper is really to come to terms with the political theological foundations of the Americas. And thank you.
We will start again at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much, Eduardo.